Alright, welcome back to a brand new video. In this video, I'm going to go ahead and teach you all how you can set up OAuth2 with Google with the NestJS framework. So that way, your customers will be able to log into your platform using Google as their third-party provider. So I also have a checklist of things that we'll need to do because there are a lot of things that we'll need to definitely cover. So that's why this video will be fairly long, but we'll try to go through every single point concisely and without wasting too much time. So the first thing that you'll want to do is go over to the Google Cloud Console, and you're going to want to create a brand new project. So I'll do that by just selecting this drop down. I'm going to see a pop-up over here where I can select my projects, but I'm going to go ahead and just click on New Project. Whoops. And I'm going to go ahead and just click on Create. You can just leave the project name alone. You can name it whatever you want, but I'll just leave it as this for now. So it should take a couple seconds, and once it's done, I'm going to go ahead and just click on Select Project. Okay, so I'm now working with that project, where actually did it even select? Seems like it didn't even create. Okay, there we go. Just had to refresh the page. So I'm working with this project right now, so I'm going to go ahead and go over to the search bar. I'm going to go ahead and search for credentials. So I'm just going to type credentials, and you're going to select the one that has the API icon, not the one with the Google Maps, right? Because we're not working with that. Select this one, APIs and services. Click on that. Whoops. Click on that, and then go ahead, and you're going to see this interface over here. Now, since we're working with OAuth2, we're going to need to configure the OAuth consent screen first. So we can just click on this button, or just go over to the OAuth consent screen tab, and we're going to need to configure this. So because we're not working with Google Workspace, there's no point for us to even select internal. So for the user type, we're just going to select external. That means external users, like any user with a Google account, will be able to test this application. And our application by default is in test mode, just making sure that you all know about that. So let's go ahead and just give our app a name. Let's just call this NestJS Google OAuth2. For the support email, I'm just going to enter my email right over here. And I'm going to just go ahead and add my developer email. And I'm just going to go ahead and click Save and Continue. You can fill the other fields if you want to. For the scopes, we're going to go ahead and add only two scopes. That's only going to be the email and the profile scope. You can obviously add more depending on what your application needs to do on behalf of the user. But we'll just only add email and profile. That will give us the basic information like the user's email address and any personal info that is public. So like the full name, the profile picture, etc. So let's click on Update. And let's click on Save and Continue. And then for test users, because our application is in test mode, in order for us to actually use or test our application, we need to add the email addresses that's going to be testing the application. So I'm going to go ahead and add my email address. And of course, if you wanted to test your application with different email accounts, you would have to add those email addresses as well. All right, and we are done with setting up the consent screen. So let's go over to the credentials tab now, and we can then create our OAuth2 client ID. So you just click on Create Credentials, select OAuth Client ID, go ahead and select Web Application, name it whatever you want, and for the authorized redirect URI, I'm going to go ahead and just set this right away. But basically, this is going to be the URL that Google will call once the user has finished authenticating. So whether it fails or it succeeds, it's going to go to this URL. Now we don't have that configured yet on our server because we don't have a NestJS server running or implemented just yet. But I'm just going to set the URL right now. So we're also working in development mode, so I'm going to be using localhost obviously. So the port is going to be 3001. So we'll make sure that our Nest server listens to requests on that port. So it's going to run on port 3001. And the endpoint is going to be /API/auth/Google/redirect. And like I said, when we implement the endpoint, we're going to need to make sure that this endpoint is actually registered, like it actually exists, that NestJS recognizes it. Okay, so let's go ahead and just click on create because we only have one redirect URL, and we are done. So we have our client ID and our client secret. I'm going to copy these later, but you can go ahead and just copy this and save it to like Notepad temporarily. We're going to have to, I'll show you later on where we need these values to put inside our code base. For now, just ignore them for now. But of course, make sure that your client secret is kept secret. And if you always want to get the values back, just click on the OAuth client application and you can just look for them over here. And if your client secret ever gets exposed or leaked, you can always just reset the secret. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually create the NestJS application now. So I'm in my Windows PowerShell right now. I'm in my documents directory. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and generate a new Nest project. So I'm going to go ahead and use the Nest CLI. So I'll type Nest new and then the project name. And I'll call this Google OAuth2 tutorial. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. And for the package manager, I'm going to choose npm. You can choose yarn or pnpm if you want to, but I'm just going to leave it as npm. And this will take some time to finish installing, so I'll get back to you all once it's done. Alright, so our project has finished generating. So let's go ahead and cd into that folder. Okay, so Google OAuth2 tutorial. And let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code. Okay, so we're going to have all of our generated files. We're not going to really be working with these, so if you want to, you can go ahead and remove them. But I'm not going to remove them, I'll just leave it there for now. But it shouldn't really affect your application in any way. What I'll do is I'll go inside the main.ts file, and we're going to go ahead and just change the port to port 3001. Because as I said earlier, we're using port 3001. And also, our endpoints are also going to be prefixed with API. So instead of having to manually set the endpoint ourselves to be prefixed with /API, I'm going to reference the app instance, so the Nest application, and I can call the method sets global prefix, and then it's going to go ahead and be API. So now by default, every single endpoint will be prefixed with /API. Let's also just run our application just to make sure that there's no issues. I'm going to run it in dev mode, so we'll type npm run start :dev. And it should be running on port 3001. So I'm going to go to my browser and I'll go ahead and visit the application. So let me just show you. So we have our application up and running. Let's go to /API. And you can see that this is the app controller response, because we have a controller over here. And this is the most base level path, right? So it's just going to give us hello world. Okay, so ignore that though, don't worry about it. We're going to go ahead and set up the authentication module. So we're going to go into the source folder, and you could use the Nest CLI to generate this if you want to. I'm not going to, but I will go ahead and do this. The only thing that I will generate is a module. So I'll go ahead and do nest g module. So G stands for generate, and we want to generate a module schematic. And I'm going to call it auth. So I'll generate the module, but I'm not going to go ahead and generate the controller or the service class, because I personally like doing those things myself, or creating those things myself. So inside the auth module folder, you can see that it created a new folder for us. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file called auth.controller.ts. And we're going to create a class. Whoops. I'm going to call it auth controller. And I'm going to use the controller decorator, which will register this class as a controller and marks it as a Nest controller. Okay, and the controller basically allows you to receive inbound requests and produce outbound responses. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and name this controller auth. So this will actually be the actual endpoint resource, right? So when we mark this as whatever name we want to, every single request that we have afterwards, right, is going to be prefixed with auth. And because we have the global prefix set to API that we configured here, we need to prefix our auth resource with /API. All right, so now that we have our controller, let's go ahead and make sure our module recognizes it. So inside auth.module.ts, inside the curly braces that is inside this module over here, okay, we're going to go ahead and add the controllers property. And this is an array. We're also going to do the same thing for providers, which is going to be for things like the service class, the strategy, and a bunch of other providers. So for controllers, we're just going to pass in the auth controller class, which is going to be imported from the same folder. So it just imported from over here. And that's pretty much how you can register the controller. If I go to my command prompt, if I look at the logs, you can see that our application restarted. And you can see that auth controller was mapped. And you can see that this /API/auth route has been registered. Okay, so these are some helpful debug logs. If I were to remove it, and if I save, you're going to see that auth controller is not being mapped at all. So that's a good way to know if your routes are being registered. Okay, so we're pretty much done with registering the actual controller. Now let's go ahead and set up two routes that we'll need. So we're going to create a method. So I'll call it, let's do handle login. So this is going to be the method that's going to take care of handling logins for users. Okay, and we're going to need to decorate this with the get decorator. So that comes from the NestJS common package. And we need to call this method because it's a method, right? Decorators are methods. And we're going to pass in the path. So that path is just going to be Google/login. So the way that this works, right, is we're basically saying, okay, the user has to visit /auth or /API/auth/Google/login. And then that request will be sent to this method, which is going to be used to handle it. So I can go and just return something like message Google authentication, something like this, right? And I'll show you how this works. So let's do that real quick. And you can see that I visited /API/auth/Google/login, and we get the response back. Okay, and we'll also have to do the same thing for the redirect URL, because these are really the two URLs that we're building out. We're building the main URL that the user is going to visit to log in. So this URL is going to actually have to redirect the user to the Google's OAuth2 screen. So when the user or the customer visits this endpoint, it's going to redirect them to Google. Okay, and once the user successfully or fails to authenticate, it's going to Google is going to redirect them back to our redirect URL. So let's go ahead and use the get decorator, and we need to go ahead and define the endpoint as /Google/redirect. And remember, it needs to match the redirect URL that we configured in the OAuth consent screen earlier. Okay, so let's name this function or method handle redirect, and I'll just return a message called OK. Okay, so I'll just leave a comment here that also just says that this is the /API/auth/Google/redirect endpoint, and we're running on port 3001. So if you put everything together, it's the same exact matching URL that we set earlier. Okay, and you can change it if you want to. You don't have to have it exactly the way I have it. Okay, so we're done with this controller for now. Let's go ahead and exit out of here. All right, so the next thing that we'll need to do is we'll need to actually configure a service file for the authentication module. But because that's not really super important right now, we're going to skip that. We're going to go back to it, but I'm going to go ahead and configure the Google strategy first, just so that you can actually see how Passport is going to handle everything. Okay, so what we need to do, of course, is we need to install the Passport package. And it's not just one, it's actually 3 packages that we need to install, and I'll show you. So we need to install @NestJS/Passport. Okay, and Passport is basically a library that allows you to implement authentication for your application. It's been around for a while, so it's pretty much the go-to. So we're going to install @NestJS/Passport. We're going to install Passport itself, and then we're going to install the strategy library for Passport. So in our case, we're using Google OAuth2. So we're going to type passport / Google / or not slash dash OAuth2o. Okay, so these are the 3 packages that we're installing. Okay, so like I said, this last one, because we're using Google, we're going to install the corresponding package for the Google strategy, which is passport-google-OAuth20. So we're going to hit enter, and we're going to install all these packages. And after that's done, we're going to install the types file. So npm i-d @types passport Google OAuth20. So we're installing the types file only for passport Google OAuth20. Okay. So that's done with, we're done with that. Okay, so let's run this again. And we're going to go ahead and create a strategy class for our Google strategy. So I'm going to create a folder. I'll call this, so inside the auth folder, I'll create a new folder called utils. And I'll create a file called Google strategy.ts. And I'm going to create a class called Google strategy. And we're going to need to import some interfaces and something from the Passport libraries. So what we'll do first is we'll import Passport strategy. And this is actually a function that we're going to import from the NestJS Passport module. And basically what we want to do is we want to actually extend, so extends Passport strategy. And we're going to call this function. So this function itself actually returns a class, and we're actually extending the class that it's returning. Okay, I know it sounds a little bit weird, but bear with me for a little bit. So the argument that we'll need to pass into the Passport strategy function is the strategy class that comes from our strategy library, which is Google OAuth20. So from Google, or Passport Google OAuth20, we're going to import the strategy class, and we're going to pass this into here. Okay? And once we're done with that, we're going to go ahead and set up a constructor. And inside the constructor, we need to call the superclasses constructor. Okay? So we do that by using the super keyword and then followed with a pair of parentheses. And we're not done yet, because inside the superclasses constructor is where we need to actually set up the OAuth client properties. So things like the client ID, the client secret, the callback URL, and the scope, those all need to be configured inside here. So go ahead and pass in the client ID and paste in the client ID for your Google application. Same thing with the client secret. Same thing with the callback URL. And then for scope. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and grab my client ID. So let's get the client ID over here. Let's paste that in there. Now, I would not recommend just pasting it into the code as is. I would suggest you use environment variables, but I'm not going to do that right now. So just for the sake of this tutorial, I'll just leave it hard-coded in the code. But I encourage you to look up the NestJS config package, and there's actually documentation on the website that you can read about, and it teaches you how to use environment variables. So I'd encourage you to look that up. Okay, but like I said, just for tutorial purposes, I'll just leave it in the code as is. So I'm going to copy my client secret, and I'm going to go ahead and get my callback URL. Paste that in there. And then for the scopes, we only have 2, and they're the same ones that we had configured earlier in the OAuth consent screen. So it's just profile and email. And we're done with this. Okay. Now we need to implement the validate method. Okay. And this is basically the method that is going to be invoked, right, when the user has successfully authenticated themselves. And it's going to give you 3 parameters, the access token, or this method takes in 3 parameters. And you can get the access token, the refresh token, and the profile. And the profile is actually the social connections details, right? So for example, if you're using Google, which we are, this profile object will give you information about the user's email, the name, their profile picture link, and a bunch of stuff. If you're using Twitter, it'll give you the same thing. If you're using Discord, same thing. So you get the idea. And the type for this profile is profile, but it comes from the package, the strategy package. So since we're using Passport Google Auth 20, we're going to import the profile interface from that package over there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just console log everything, because we're not really doing anything with this just yet because we don't have sessions or a database, so we can't really do anything yet. But we'll do that after we see what's going on. So I want to actually show you how we can test this. Okay, before we continue though, we do need to obviously label this class as an injectable. So we're going to use the injectable decorator, and then we need to go ahead and add this as a provider in our auth module. So in the array for providers, we'll pass in Google strategy, and that's going to be imported from the utils folder right there. Okay, so we're not done yet. We do need to invoke Passport, because right now we're not able to invoke Passport. And the question is, how do we do that? Okay, because I mentioned earlier, right, we have these two URLs. This Google/login URL is going to be the URL that customers will be, that you'll send the customers to. And the purpose is supposed to redirect the user to Google. But in order to do that, we need to actually invoke Passport, because Passport's actually the middleware that's going to handle the redirection. So how do we invoke Passport? Well, what we need to do is we actually need to set up what's called a guard. So it's done differently in NestJS. If you've done this in Express before, in NestJS it's done a little bit differently. So we're going to need to configure a guard. Okay, and I'll show you how we can do that. So inside the utils folder, we're going to create a new file called guards.ts. And pretty much guards allow you to protect certain endpoints in your application. So if the user is not authenticated, you can just send them a 403 or a 401. Okay, so let's go ahead and implement our guard. So the guard is just going to be a class. So I'll call this Google Auth Guard. And we're going to extend the Auth Guard right over here. And this is a function that also returns a class as well. And the type, we're just going to pass in the provider, or the OAuth provider, which is Google, like that. Okay? And then what we want to do is we want to implement the async can activate method. And VS Code is going to autocomplete a bunch of this stuff, but I'm just going to remove this annotation because we only care about the context. And let me remove this observable import up top here. So inside here, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and get the value that is returned from can activate, or the superclass's can activate method call. So we're going to reference the superclass, and the superclass has a method called can activate. We're going to pass in the context. Okay, and this is an asynchronous method call. So we're going to await this. Okay. And pretty much what we're going to do here is we're also going to do one more thing. We're going to go ahead and cast this value as a Boolean. Okay? Then we're going to go ahead and get the request. So the execution context actually gives you a lot of different methods and properties. So I would suggest you read more on execution context if you want to learn more about it on the NestJS docs. They have well-documented stuff on the official NestJS docs. So just Google execution context NestJS and you'll learn more about that. But what we want to do is we want to switch the protocol to HTTP, because we're using HTTP, and we want to call the getRequest method. Okay, and then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and call super.login, and we want to pass in the request object there. So in a way, similar to Express, it pretty much uses this method to actually log the user in. Okay. And then finally, we want to return the value of activate. Okay. So we're pretty much done with this auth guard. Don't worry so much about what's really going on here. All you need to know is that this auth guard acts as like a middleman, and it takes care of actually passing in the request so that it can actually authenticate the user. Okay, so we also want to make sure that we label this or mark this as an injectable, and we're pretty much done with this. Next thing that we'll need to do is we'll take this auth guard and we're going to go ahead and use it for both of our handle login and handle redirect methods. So we do that by using the use guards decorator. So on top of our method, we'll call use guards, and we want to pass in the Google Auth Guard class. So Google Auth Guard, and we want to do the same thing for the handle redirect method. You want to do it for both. Okay? So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and actually test out our implementation. So let's go over to our console, make sure our app is running, and let's go over to our browser, and let's go ahead and refresh everything and make sure that everything works. So let's refresh. So you can see that it redirected us to our Google OAuth2 page. Okay, if I actually were to just get rid of the use guards, right? And if I save and I were to go back to that endpoint again, /API/auth/Google/login, nothing's going to happen. Okay, so it's this use guards decorator along with the actual guard itself that walks us through like the whole middleware that takes care of redirecting us to the Google OAuth2 page. Okay, so now we can go ahead and revisit this URL. And what we can do is let's go ahead and look at our console. We can see that nothing is here currently, but when I go ahead and log in to my account, you're going to see that one, it's going to redirect me to the redirect URL, rightfully so, right? Though it's giving us this 401 unauthorized, and it makes sense because we don't have anything like sessions enabled. We aren't returning anything from our strategies validate method, right? If we look in the validate method, we're not returning anything. So since we're returning undefined, right, that's a falsy value. So it's going to treat that as if the user did not actually authorize themselves. But let's look at the console and let's take a look at what we actually logged. So you can see that all this stuff over here is being logged from this validate method. So this validate method was invoked, okay? And we were able to successfully get the access token. The refresh token is undefined. I would encourage you to actually read more about why that's the case, because there's a specific reason why. So you can look that up on Google, and they'll tell you how to handle it, but we're not going to get into that right now. We have the profile object, and you can see that we have the ID, we have the display name, we have the name, emails, photos, and a bunch of different properties. Okay, and you can do a lot of stuff with this. You can save this to your database. You can, use this to you can send this back to the user so they can, get information about themselves. You can do whatever you want. Okay, but that is pretty much the whole gist of the Google OAuth 2. Now, are we doing anything meaningful with this data? No, right? We don't have a fully working authentication system yet. But right now, what we've done so far was we have Google OAuth 2 being correctly invoked. The next step, and for the rest of this video, we'll need to actually work on setting up sessions as well as setting up a database, right? The reason why we need to set up a database is because we need to connect to the database first, and then we need to actually save the user to the database, okay? Once we have the user saved in the database, we can then start doing stuff like serializing and deserializing the user upon every request, and then we can save users to the sessions whenever the user is logged in. And that's important because if you want to implement a login feature where it's persistent and users can stay logged into the application, then you must have something like sessions. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to the next part of the rest of this tutorial, which is just configuring all that stuff. All right, so let's quickly look at our checklist real quick. So we've done a lot of stuff so far in the first part of this video. So we were able to create an OAuth 2 app. We create the Nest project, the NestJS project. We create the auth controller. We create the strategy. We also create the auth guard. So the only things that we have not done yet was create the auth service, and there was a reason why I decided to actually delay that, because I wanted to actually show you all how to invoke Passport, but we'll create the auth service in this part of the video. We're also going to go ahead and connect to a database, and I should also write that we're going to go ahead and create a type ORM entity, because we are going to be using type ORM, and then we'll configure sessions. So if you go over to the NestJS docs, and if you click on databases right over, where is it? Database over here. Okay, there's actually a lot of different integrations that you can read about. So for example, if you want to use MongoDB, you can, and they do have docs on that if you want to use it with Mongoose, that is. If you want to use something like Prisma, if you want to use MicroORM, Sequelizer, they have a bunch of documentation on how you can set this up. Now, I personally like using TypeORM. I've been using it for all of my projects, and I absolutely love it, so I can advocate for that. Okay, so we're going to be using TypeORM alongside with My Sql. Now, it doesn't really matter what database you use, because in the end, the data is going to be saved in the database regardless. Okay, so you can choose whichever one you want, but for this specific video, I'll use TypeORM with My Sql. So what we're going to do is we're going to install NestJS /TypeORM. We're going to install TypeORM, and then we'll install My Sql too. So let's go over to our application, and let's install @NestJS TypeORM, and then My Sql too. And once that's done installing, we'll configure the TypeORM module. And so here I'm going to have to pass in my credentials for My Sql database. I'm using a localhost database, so it doesn't really matter. But you can also connect to a remote database if you want to. Okay, so once that's done, we'll go ahead and import the TypeORM module. So it's done. Let's go ahead and do this. So what I'll do is inside app module.ts, I'm going to go ahead and import the TypeORM module right over here. It's going to be imported from @NestJS /TypeORM, and we're going to go ahead and call for root, and this is where we're going to pass in the TypeORM module options. So I'm going to set the type to be MySQL because we're using MySQL. If you want to use something like PostgreSQL, you can. Okay, but I'll use MySQL. For the host, it's going to be localhost. And I'm going to need to pass in the username, password, and the database name. So give me 1 second. I need to grab that. So for the username, I have test user. For the password, it's test user 123. For database, we're just gonna call this Google OAuth2 app. And I think that's actually most of the ones that we need. I think we need a couple of others. Oh, we need to specify the port. Let me do that after the host. The port by default for a MySQL server is 3306. And we also need to specify a entities property. And I'll show you how we can create a TypeORM entity. And then we'll set synchronize to true. Okay, so we're done with that. Okay, now let's go ahead and just run our application, and let's just make sure that the connection actually works. It is going to throw an error because our database does not exist, so we'll have to manually create it. Okay, yep, so it's able to connect to the database, or it's unable to actually because the database does not exist. But the username and password though do work fine. Okay, so that's good. So how do we actually create a database in MySQL? Well, assuming that you are using MySQL, all you need to do is just log into your MySQL server. And you can do that either using the CLI tool, or you can use MySQL Workbench. However you choose to do it, it doesn't matter. But right now I'm in my MySQL console. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just type create database, and then the exact name, Google _OAuth2 _app. And then semicolon, and then we're done. So if I rerun the app now, it's going to go ahead and show you that everything's going to work fine. Perfect. So our database has been successfully created. So what's next? So the next thing that we need to do is we need to create what's called a type ORM entity. And basically the entity is going to allow us to map actual JavaScript objects into actual records in the database, right? So if we had a regular user database table that had fields or columns such as ID, username, password, email, etc., all of those columns would have to map over to an actual JavaScript or TypeScript object in our case, right? So, and that's the beauty of ORMs, is because they take care of all this for us. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create an entity. So I'll create a new folder, call it type ORM, and inside this folder, I'll create a folder called entities, and I'll create a new file, call it user.ts. And what I want to do is I'm going to create a class called user, and I'm going to annotate this class with the entity decorator. And this is going to take in some options, and I can name this whatever I want, but I'll just leave it. Actually, I'll just leave it as users, actually, because I think by default it'll just be called user, all in lowercase. So it's whatever you name the class, it's what this is going to be named by default. But you can always configure that. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to define properties for our user. Now, here's the thing, though. You obviously want to make sure that your user is going to have relatable properties, right? And since we also are using Google OAuth2, we kind of need to make sure that the properties for the Google OAuth2 application relate to our actual user entity in some way. So for example, when we authenticate using Google OAuth2, we have properties such as the Google ID, we have their display name, we have their profile picture, we have their email address, right? So you have to determine which of these properties are very important. So I personally think that the email address is important, so we'll create a field for that. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and set this to be a column by using the column decorator. Just like that. Okay, now what I also recommend for your entities is every single entity has what's called a primary generated column, and this will act as a primary key. Okay, you can also have your own unique IDs too, but it's important to have, or I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. You can have unique IDs that come from third-party providers, but it's also important for you to have your own unique primary keys for your own local database, and not using just like, Google's IDs, for example, and using that as a primary key. Okay, so let me go ahead and actually do this. I'm going to actually just relog in because I don't remember what properties exist. So let me do that real quick. Okay, if we look in the console, okay, so this is what I was talking about, right? You see over here, this ID, this is the Google account ID. I don't want to use this as our application's primary key or our user's primary key. Now, you could use this and display it to the user, right? Or you don't even need to save this, but it's only if you need it, you can save it. But I'm not going to bother saving that though. What I will save is I'll save the display name. I could also save the emails as well. And I'll also save, you can also save the profile picture too, but I'll just save the display name and the email. Okay, so we'll do our own primary key email, display name, and I think that is it. Yeah, like I said, if you need more, you can always just add more properties if you need to, but this should work just fine for now. Okay, so now to actually register our entity and have it actually be created as a table in our database, we need to actually pass in our user class into this entities array. So I can go ahead and just import that from /typeorm/entity/user. Okay, and if I save, let's just make sure everything's good. Okay, let's go into our database. So I'm going to go ahead and type use Google OAuth2 app because we need to step into the database. And if I type show tables, you're going to see I have my users table. And you can see that we can describe the table, and you can see that literally exactly what we had created for our entity as a TypeScript class, it was converted into a table and generated inside our database, which is great. And that's why ORMs are beautiful and powerful. Okay, so that's pretty much done. We're done with creating an entity. Now what we need to do is we need to actually create the actual user. So we're going to actually have to write some code for this. And to do this, we need to also create our auth service. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside the auth folder, I'll create a new file called auth.service.ts. And I'm going to create a class called Auth Service. And I'm going to go ahead and label this as an injectable because this is going to be a provider. Okay. And the Auth Service class is going to take care of authenticating the user. Well, not only authenticating the user, but it'll take care of actually validating the user is what I just say. All right. The authentication actually is controlled mostly or primarily by the validate method, right? Because over here, if we return a truthy value, that means the user is successfully authenticated. If we return a falsy value, that means the user is not authenticated. So the validate method is actually the primary method that controls the authentication mechanism. The auth service is really just to implement the business logic. So it's mainly used to connect to the database, check to see if the user exists. If it doesn't, create it. If it does, return that user. Okay? So first, let's go ahead and create a method called validate user. And this validate user method, we will need to take in details, right? We're going to need to take in the user's email, and we're going to take in all of the properties that we want to save to the database. So what I'll do is I will create a new, let's see, let me create a new folder called utils, and I'll create a file called types.ts. And I'm going to go ahead and create a type called user details. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to mock the user, right? I want to label, I want to like design what the user is supposed to look like. So the user is going to have, or actually, yeah, it's going to have something like this. It's going to have an email, which is a string. It's going to have a display name, which is a string as well. And it's going to primarily have these two values, okay? And that's going to be all we'll need for now. So let's go back to our service, and we'll pass in a parameter for this method. So this method is going to take in one parameter, and the type is going to be user details, okay? And this validate user method is going to need to query the database. It's going to need to search for a user with a unique value. And we know that email addresses are going to be unique, okay, because the email address itself belongs to only one person, right? So we can use that to search the database to see if that user exists. If it doesn't, then we'll create the user. If it does, then we'll just update the existing values, and then we will return. We won't update the values though, we'll just return the existing user, but you guys can take care of updating the user if you want to. Okay, it is a good recommendation that I encourage you to do. Okay, so let's just go ahead and console log auth service, and we'll console log details, just so that you all can see every single step that we are doing. And the next question is, how do we actually query the database inside auth service, right? So with a framework like NestJS, the way that we need to query databases is we don't just install some kind of database client and then just like use like a raw query string or like a raw statement to query the database. We actually use what's called repositories. Okay, we use the repository pattern, and the NestJS docs actually has a lot of information about repositories, and they show you how you can actually use them. Okay, it's actually very easy. So what we need to do is inside our auth service class, we're going to implement the constructor, and we're going to use the inject repository decorator. And this comes from the NestJS type ORM package. And then we're going to pass in the user entity just like that. Okay, and then we're going to do private read only. And then we're going to call this field user repository. And then we can type annotate it as repository, which is going to need to be imported from the type ORM package. And this is actually a generic type. So we can actually specifically pass in the user type itself, like that. Okay? So now we know that this is specifically a user repository and not just a regular repository because it's generic. Okay, now we're going to get an error. And the reason why is because we need to actually add the user as an actual provider. The reason why we haven't gotten the error yet is because we have not added the auth service as a provider. So we need to actually do that before we actually do anything else with it. So let's do that real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and pass in an object. And this is how you should actually register your providers, by using tokens. So what do I mean by that? So you're going to pass in an object and you're going to set the provide property. And this is basically going to be the token that you're going to be using when you want to inject your auth service wherever you need to inject it inside your application. So I'm going to call this token Auth Service. And then we're going to set the property use class. And that is just going to be the Auth Service class. So our service class. So it's looking like this. And now you're going to see that we're going to get the error, right? Because we just registered our provider. So it's not complaining about the way that we registered the provider. It's specifically complaining about the user dependency. And if you read the logs, it tells you that it cannot resolve the dependency of the Auth Service class. And it tells you if user repository is a provider, right? Is it part of the current auth module? And we haven't actually registered the user as a provider yet. If I were to delete this part over here, you'll see that the error just goes away. Okay, so let's fix this error inside our auth module. So basically any module that you use type ORM entities, you'll need to actually configure those entities. And the way you do that is inside module, inside the object, you're going to go ahead and specify the imports property, which is an array. And you're going to go ahead and import the type ORM package. And you're going to go ahead and call the for feature method. And this takes in an array of entities for type ORM. And all we're going to do is just pass in the user entity. So we're going to have to import that from the type ORM folder. And I'll just auto import that. And if we look at the logs, the error goes away, which is great. All right. So I know we've done a lot so far, but let me just recap what we did. We basically injected the user repository. The repository is going to allow us to actually query the MySQL database on behalf of the user table. Okay, so we don't have to worry about writing actual SQL statements. We can just go ahead and reference this.user repository, and then we can call a bunch of different CRUD related methods like find one, find by, create, delete, a bunch of other different methods, right, to perform operations on the user's table. Okay, and then we also just registered the auth service as a provider, and we also need to configure the type ORM module inside this auth module because we're using repositories, okay, because it's part of a dependency. Okay, so what do we do next? The next thing that we need to do is we need to actually call validate user, and then inside validate user, we're going to need to query the database by invoking the user repository find method. So let's go ahead and piece everything together. So let's go into our Google strategy file, and inside the Google strategy file is where we're going to need to inject our auth service class, because we've created the class, but we haven't done anything with it yet. Okay, so we're going to inject this auth service class. So inside the Google strategy class, we're going to go ahead and inside the constructor, we're going to go ahead and use the inject decorator. And this is how you would inject any service. You'll use the inject decorator, and then you're going to pass in the token. So the token is literally what the value of provide is, right? So it's auth underscore service. And remember, if you register multiple different services, you want to make sure that the provide value is different, right? Because underneath the hood, NestJS uses a container to keep track of every single dependency, and it uses the token to make sure that it maps to the correct instance of the class. Okay, so if you have multiple classes or multiple dependencies that are mapped by the same token, there's going to be problems. Okay, so we're going to pass in the auth underscore service token, and then over here we're going to just set this to private read only, and then we're going to call the property user service, and then we'll type annotate this with our class. So auth service, just like that. Okay, let's look at the logs. No errors. Now watch what happens if I actually remove this as a provider. We should be getting an error, and it's going to say that it cannot resolve the dependencies of Google Strategy, and that's because Auth Service is a provider, and we are not using dependency injection when we are trying to inject this in our Google Strategy file. Okay, so just make sure you have this configured. Otherwise, you're going to get that error. All right, so now that we've injected our user service, or actually, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call it user service. I meant to call this auth service. My apologies. Okay, so what do we want to do now? Well, we want to go ahead and call validate user. So inside the validate method, we're going to go ahead and call this dot auth service dot validate user, and we're going to pass in details. So what do we want to pass in exactly? Well, we want to pass in the email, as well as the I think it was the display name, right? But how do we get those values though? So let me actually re-log in again, because I don't remember the values. So let me just do that real quick. Okay, so to get the email, so this is an array. So I guess what we'll do is we'll reference profile.displayName, and then for emails we'll do profile, and then we'll just hard code it by doing subscript 0. So here's what I'll do. So let's do this. For email, we'll do profile.emails subscript 0, and then for display name, we'll do profile.displayName like that. Let's see what's going on over here. I guess it doesn't like that. Oh wait, do I need to? Oh, value. There we go. Whoops, my bad. Okay, yeah, so profile.emails at subscript 0, because emails is an array, dot value. Okay, so remember, the validate user method is going to be responsible for returning a user. And the thing with OAuth2 is that since we're using third-party providers, it actually never really is supposed to actually fail on behalf of your platform's application. If it fails because of the OAuth2 provider, right? Because, for example, if you're using username and password, right, it can fail if the user provides an incorrect password, right? But for OAuth2, it only fails when the Google servers returned an invalid response, and that could also be because they may have entered the wrong credentials on the Google platform. Okay, but realistically, with OAuth2, it's always going to return a user. Okay, so but we'll still need to obviously implement the corresponding logic to handle situations when it does end up being undefined. But theoretically, it shouldn't though. But you'll see in just a second. So let's just assign the value to this variable called user, whatever the return value of validate user is. And now let's go ahead and look at the logs. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the login route. And if I look at the logs, you're going to see that we have auth service and the user details being logged. So that's good. We haven't done anything yet. So we need to go ahead and query the database now. So let me go ahead and add the async keyword in front of this method, because we are going to be using async await. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and do const user equals await this dot user repository, find one, and we're going to search by the email. So let's do find one email and then details dot email. Okay, and then what's going to happen is if the user is found, we'll return the user. Okay, and if the user is not, what's going on over here? Let me see. Email string is not assignable to parameter of type find one user options. And email. Why is it saying that? I'm kind of confused. Give me 1 second. All right, I believe that the actual method that we need is find one by. Might have been a new update with the package. I'm not too sure because I've always used find one before. But I think we need to use find one by, and that's fine. So we'll specify the email. You can see that now email actually shows up as a searchable, as a property for our query. So we'll reference details dot email. And it makes sense to use the email to query the user because the Google user cannot change their email address. Okay, so that means that you'll never have to worry about it, about getting the incorrect user. So, okay, so let's go ahead and log whatever the value of user is. So if the user is found, like I said, in an actual application, you can just update the user's properties and then return the new user. But I'm not going to do that because I don't want to prolong this video. But I would encourage you to, as an exercise, to do that yourself and update the user yourself before returning it. Okay. But if the user is not found, then we'll create the user. And to create the user, what we do is we go ahead and call the create method. And then we just pass in the properties. So email, and I could just actually pass in details like this because details contains the same properties that match the type ORM properties as well. The ID is auto-generated, but email and display name need to be set. Okay, so this method does not need to be awaited because it's not an asynchronous method. Okay, but we do need to go ahead and actually save the user. So we can do return this dot, or not this, new user dot save, or I'm sorry, it's return this dot user repository dot save new user. And this will basically, now this is an asynchronous call, but that's fine because we will await that call, and we are doing that. Okay, and when we return this value, it's going to give back the new user. Okay, so let's go ahead and write some more logs. So let's do console log, user not found, creating. I just want to write these logs out so you all see the whole process and how everything works. Okay, and then what we'll do here is we'll say return user. We'll use a ternary operator. So, or actually we could just do this. We can just do return user or null. And since null is a falsy value, that means that the whole authentication failed. We're not really failed, but like it went through and the user was not authenticated, which means that it's going to give them a 401. Okay, so if the user was found, return it. If the user is undefined or a false value, return null. And I'll console log everything, like I said, so you all see how everything works. So let's go ahead and test it out now. So you can see that now it's giving us a 500, and that's fine. It's something to do with these sessions, okay? But you can see that if we look at the logs, you can see that we have null being logged, and that is coming from right over here because the user was not found. It says user not found, creating, and then it logs validate, and then it logs the user itself, okay? And right over here in the validate method, it's returning the user itself, okay? And right now, the reason why we're getting this error is because what's supposed to happen next is it's supposed to take care of serializing the user into the session itself so the user can actually stay logged in. Now, that is actually the very last thing that we'll need to do is just configure the session. There's also one more thing that we'll need to do, which is configuring the session store. But I have videos on my channel that show you how to configure that. So I'm not going to go over that in this video because we're already at the 1 hour mark anyways. But I will show you how we can configure sessions. It's actually really simple. So what you're going to do is you're going to go back to your console and you're going to go ahead and install the session package. So let me go ahead and show you where you can read more about sessions. So if you go over to the NestJS docs under techniques session, it teaches you more about this. You can read more in depth about it if you want to, but we're just going to install the Express session package. And then we'll install the types as well. Okay. And once we've installed that, we just need to enable sessions in our application. So we'll go into the main.ts file and we'll import the Express session right over here like this. So import asterisk as session from express-session. Okay. Now, one more thing is that we will also need to import passport because we are using passport with session. So, whoops, it should just be passport. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and enable sessions first. So let's do app.use. So it's similar to how you would enable session middleware in Express.js. So app.use, you call session, which is a function, and you pass in options for the session. So for the secret, this is just going to be some random string, which is used to encrypt and decrypt the cookies. I'm going to go ahead and set save uninitialized to false, as well as resave to false. And then we can go ahead and specify the cookie property, which is an object. And inside this object, I'm going to set the max age of the cookie. I'll set it to be, let's just do 1 minute. You can set it for however long you want. And I think that is, for the most part, majority of the properties that you need set. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, so now that we have sessions enabled, we do need to also enable passport with sessions. So all we need to do is just call app.use passport.initialize, and then app.use passport.session. Okay, and then we'll also need to do this. We need to go into the auth module. So right over here, or I'm sorry, not the auth module, the app module. And then we need to actually register passport as well. So what we do is right over here, we're going to go ahead and import the passport module from NestJS passport. And you're going to go ahead and call register. And you're going to set session to true, like this. Okay, and that should take care of enabling sessions with passport. Okay, and I believe that should be it for everything else. We've initialized it, we've enabled sessions, and we also enabled sessions as well. And yeah, so that should be it with sessions. Okay, now we're not quite done yet. The last thing that we need to do on top of all of this, I know it's a whole lot of process, but like I said, it's a long process, but hopefully it's not that difficult. What we need to do next is we need to set up the serialize and deserialize methods. So again, it's similar to how you would do that with Express, okay, but it's just done differently. So inside the auth module, inside utils folder, I'm going to create a file called serializer.ts, and we'll create a class called session serializer, and this class is going to extend the passport serializer class like that. Okay, and what we want to do in this class is we want to go ahead and do this. We're going to inject the Auth Service, same way how we did it in the Google Strategy class. It's like this. Okay. And then what we need to do is let's call the superclass constructor as well. We need to go ahead and implement the serialize user method as well as the deserialize user method. And basically similar to Express, right? The serialize user method is used for serializing the user into the session. So it does that whenever you log in. Okay. And the deserialize user method is used for restoring the session. So it takes the session and it figures out who the session belongs to. Okay. And inside this deserialize user method, we actually need to find out who the session belongs to. And we do that by searching for the user in the database. So there's actually going to be one more method that we'll implement in the Auth Service class, but we'll do that in just a second. First thing I'll do inside the serialize user method is I'll go ahead and call done, pass in null, and then pass in the user object. And instead of type annotating this user object as any, we'll type annotate it as user, the user entity. And it's giving me this linting issue. I'm just going to go ahead and ignore this for now. Okay. And for the deserialize user method, the payload is also the actual user object itself, but I'll just leave it as any for now because it could theoretically be anything. Okay, and I'll also disable the ESLint for this line too. Whoops, not that one. It should be let's see, this one. I'll just disable it for the entire file. There we go. Okay, so inside this method, we will need to call a method that's going to search for the user. So we're going to need to reference this, the Auth Service. And right now we only have the validate user method, which only searches for the user. But I'm sorry, it only validates the user by searching for the user and creating it if it doesn't exist, right? But what we want to do is we want to just call a method called findUser that we're going to implement right now. That's going to take in the user's ID. So we're going to do payload.id like this. Now, like I said, this is obviously going to be a user instance. So if you want to, you could just actually annotate this as a user if you want to, but I'll just leave it as payload ID. And remember, the user instance itself has the ID property. It's the primary key. Okay, you're going to use the primary key to search for the user. And what we're going to do is let's just await that call. And then we'll store the return value into this user variable. Okay, and if the user exists, so we'll use a ternary operator. So if the user is truthy, we'll go ahead and return null for the error, because the first parameter is the error object. If there's no error, you just pass a null. And for the second parameter, it's the user instance itself. However, if the user was not found, we pass in null and null, which just basically means that there was no error, and there was also no user found, which means that this would actually fail, which means that the user is not authenticated. So it would say 401, okay, because we passed a null for the user. But let's go ahead and implement this findUser method inside Auth Service real quick. And we need to take in the ID, which is a number. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and create a variable called user, and we will reference the repository, and we'll call find by, or actually I think we just do find one, and we should be able to pass in the ID. I'm not sure why though, it just doesn't let me specify options, but I guess we'll just do this. We'll do find. There used to be a method called find by ID, but I think they got rid of that. But we'll just do find one by, and we'll pass in the ID like that. Okay, and we'll just return. Let's see. I think we'll just return user. And then we'll have to just check to see if the user exists or not, which we are doing over here, which is good. Okay, and I'll also just go ahead and log everything as well. So let me log everything, deserialize user, and then serialize user. And we'll also need to label this class as an injectable. And we're going to need to add this as a provider in the auth module. So let's do that. Session serializer. Okay. And that is going to be it for the sessions. So let's run the application again. And let's test everything out. Okay, so let's go into our application. Let's log in. And you see how it says OK. Okay, and you can look at the logs and let's look at what's going on. You can see that it says serialize user or serializer user. Okay, and now if I were to actually visit any endpoint right now, let's go to /API. You're going to see that every single time I visit any endpoint, it's going to say deserialize user, because every single request, it's going to take the request, it's going to figure out who the session belongs to, right? And it basically validates if the user is logged in or not. It validates the session itself. Okay, so if the user was actually no longer like logged in, if they did not have like a valid session, it would know that, and it would tell you that the user is not logged in. Okay, but that is pretty much how you can handle sessions in this situation. So for the most part, our whole implementation works. Okay, and if you wanted to protect your endpoint, you could very much do so very easily, actually. For example, inside the auth controller, if you were to actually get the user's object. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's create a quick little method, user. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the request. I'm going to get the request object. So I'm going to import that from the Express library. And I'm also going to use the request decorator that comes from NestJS Common. And if I were to go ahead and log request.user, okay, and I'll go ahead and do return request.user like this. Well, let me do this actually. Let's do if rec.user return authenticated, else return message unauthor not authenticated. Let's just test this out real quick. Okay, so let's go ahead and visit /API/auth/ I think it's users, what we call it, right? No, we call it status. You can see it says not authenticated. So let's log in now. So let's log in. It redirects us to the redirect URL. Now let's visit the status URL again. You can see it says authenticated. Okay, and the reason why this works is because the session has been serialized, and when it serializes the session, it actually attaches the user object onto the request object. Again, if you've done this with Express before, the concepts are very similar. It's just the way that you do things are a lot different. Okay, so that is going to be pretty much it for this whole video. Again, all of the code will be in the description. So if you have any issues, you'll have like a reference. Okay, again, I know that the video was really long, but I didn't want to break this up into separate different videos because I know some of the feedback that people have given me was that it's really hard to find out the next videos. So I figured, you know what, I would just put everything in one video and see how everyone likes that. So if you have any questions, I have a Discord server, or you can just leave a comment down below. But the best way to get help is by joining the Discord server and asking your questions there. I'll be more than happy to help you all. Okay, so go ahead and go on the GitHub link. That's it. The link is in the description. Download the code, play around with it, modify it to your needs. But you have a fully functioning OAuth2 with Google working right now. I'll make some follow-up videos on how you can actually use this existing template to configure other OAuth2 mechanisms such as Twitter, Discord, and a bunch of other stuff. So once again, thank you for watching, and I will see you all in my next videos. Peace out.